And the purpose of this recording is to put together a little bit of our early family for so-called posterity. So, to begin with, as early as we can go back and pick it up, took place in England during the Revolution in the United States. At that time, one of our family, well, mainly the family in England, the men were physicians and surgeons. And the young man who eventually became our ancestor here was a boy whose father had died, and the family had placed him with another baker who was a surgeon as an apprentice. Well, it didn't work out quite that way. He wasn't really apprenticed, but he had to take care of the horses in the barn and feed them, etc., and he was very discouraged. So he ran away and joined Burgoyne's army. He then, of course, was moved to the United States up in the Boston area, where they were trying to straighten out the colonies, and there was some fighting in that area. He was eventually captured by the United States forces along with 500 other soldiers. And as time went on, they were transferring these 500 prisoners to New York to make an exchange with prisoners that were taken by the revolutionary forces. Well, in this trek from Boston area to New York, I believe, how many, Irma?
400.
400 of them escaped, and they had only 100 to exchange when they arrived there. And Henry Baker was one of those that deserted. He then returned up into the New England area, or rather in New York. Parcells, I believe was the name of the Parcelia, and he located there and became a farmer on a small acreage, about 40 acres. This acreage was very stony, and they had a hard time getting started. But a number of families grew out of Henry's period in that area. Eventually, they migrated to Michigan at Howell, and then on into Iowa. While they were in Michigan, my grandfather, Vestal, joined the Civil War period, and he became a soldier at that time. He was probably drafted, and he entered the service through the Michigan unit. After the Civil War period, they migrated further to the west and settled in a very rich area, farming area, in Cromwell, Iowa. There, the rest of Vestal's and Sarah's family were born, and they remained there and were successful farmers. Cromwell, Iowa. Yeah, that'd be a good idea. That is, well, we better get this right side up, Bob. That is down in the southwestern corner of Iowa. My grandfather, Vestal, and Sarah had 2 sons, and how many daughters? Oh, 1, 2, 4 daughters. And each of them had a fairly sized family, so that they multiplied quite well. When my father became a young man, he wanted to get more education, and so he went up to Indianola, Iowa, which is not too far. There we are, up just 18 miles south of Des Moines, where there was a small 2-year college named Simpson. And he attended there for 2 years, at which time he met my mother, Elizabeth Reese, who was attending the conservatory. And while there, my father played the baritone horn in the band. After he had completed the 2 years, why, he went on to Colorado College in Colorado Springs and completed his 4-year undergraduate work. He had decided at that time that he wanted to enter the ministry. So he then attended Yale University Divinity School for 1 year. But he wasn't quite certain what denomination he wanted to go into, but he had reasonably decided it would be Methodist Episcopal. So he felt that he should attend a Methodist Divinity School. So he transferred to Boston University in Boston, Massachusetts, where this work was completed. At the time of his graduation, and during all this period of college, he had a desire to go back and find his ancestors in England. Well, he earned and raised about $60, and he worked his way to England on a cattle boat. Then he bought a bicycle in England and tried to find his ancestors, but he was unsuccessful. So he returned on the cattle boat, another cattle boat, to Boston, and then he went into the ministry. Well, in the trek to the west, the family had, as I mentioned earlier, had stopped in Howell, and some members of the family had started farming there. So he always liked Michigan, so back to Michigan he went, and there he joined the Western Michigan Methodist Conference. His first ministry was at Pellston, Michigan. That's up north of Petoskey. He stayed there only for a 2-year period and was transferred to Boyne Falls. And this took place right in at the height of the lumbering period. And while at Boyne Falls in 1908, I was born at Petoskey. I was the firstborn, and the folks felt that my mother should be in a hospital, so we went up there where I was born, and then, of course, my early 2 years took place in Boyne Falls.
I being Wesley R. Baker.
Yes. I can remember quite a few things that happened during that period. They had terrible forest fires. And I can remember at noon, even though the sun was shining bright, you couldn't see it. It was so smoky. And also while we were there, my mother had accumulated considerable money. She was very thrifty of German heritage, and she bought 40 acres of good maple timberland. And she hadn't any more than bought it, and the fires burned it off. And this was agonizing to her that she would lose all that money. And I don't remember just what happened to that property. It probably went back for taxes. I can also remember that for wood to burn, we would get the broken butter molds and wooden mixing bowls that were imperfects, and we had a great big pile of these out in the backyard that we would burn for wood in the stoves to heat the house. And often they would fill up with water, and that's where I went swimming, in these great big molds. And I had a big time. Another very wonderful thing that happened right behind us, kitty corner from our house, the village doctor lived, and his name was A.N. Howe. And I believe I lived there as much as I lived at home, and they became fast family friends, and that friendship continued for years. Well, then from there, we moved down to Fife Lake, a few miles south, and my father had 3 points where he preached, and of course he didn't have a horse and buggy or anything like that to get himself around, so he had to, and there were very few roads. So he had to ride the train to these outpoints, and usually to South Boardman, where the livery would have a horse and buggy in the summer and a cutter in the winter. And then he'd go out to, I believe it was East Boardman to preach, and also at South Boardman. These were very impressive years to me. Lots of things happened. My brother Burton was born there, and the doctor was named Highfield. And that family was very close to us. Also, at that time, we had what they called local option, and that dealt with liquor. And of course, my father and mother were, being good Methodists, this was really a bad deal, and they fought it all the time. But every holiday, why, the lumberjacks would come into Fife Lake and where they could get the liquor, and then they would get drunk, and the local authorities would fill up the jail, and then they would just lay them out on the lawn in front of the jail to sleep it off. Well, this intrigued me immensely. I had to be in the middle of this thing, see what was going on. And my mother just had a conniption because I was down there seeing all this going on. And probably she figured it was the dregs of society, and it might have been, I don't know. But this was one of the things that impressed me greatly. And another thing in those early years that impressed me was the livery barn. We didn't have a horse yet, and that's where I hung out because, boy, these animals were really great. No cars at that time. But there was a lot of cussing down there, and I guess that impressed me too, as much as the horses. But anyway, Mother just had a conniption when I'd run off and go down to the livery barn because of the language I would hear. Also, at that time, it was a tough time. My dad would take the old musket that I still own and go out hunting for rabbits. Yes?
I was going to say you should identify where the musket came from.
Well, that musket was my grandfather's that he used in the Civil War. And I still have that along with the powder horn and the canteen, and I also have some of the bullets. And they had to ram this musket down from the front and put in the powder and the bullets and whatever. My dad used to go out with that to get rabbits. Well, he'd always come back, and I can remember Mother trying to rub his shoulder because it kicked so hard that almost drive his shoulder right out of its socket. But I still have that, and it'll be passed on to some of our Baker family someday. Then from there we moved down to Riverdale, which is about 20 miles west of Ithaca, and Alma rather. And lots of things happened there too. I started to school there, and the schoolhouse was right in back of our house, so I didn't have very far to go. But one of the things that happened is right on the Pine River, and it seemed like my father's 3 churches just kind of followed this river south. And he bought a horse there, and a buggy, and a cutter, and boy, that was wonderful. And we called that horse Teddy. And oh, that was a nice horse, just a great horse.
Had Heck joined the family yet?
Yes, Heck joined the family there, and I can remember that so distinctly because the birth was hard, and mother had a really tough time during that birth. So that comprised us three boys. But anyway, in the spring, that river would flood. And speaking of this horse, this is very interesting. That river would flood, and my father always wore a beard in the winter to keep his face warm, and he had a big fur coat. And one night he was coming home from one of the points one of the churches, and he had to cross this river. Well, it was flooding to the point that all the river bottom was filled, and it was rolling over the road that went up to the bridge, and so he just drove right out on this road, and there was no bridge, and he went right into the river, and the buggy too. And my father jumped, and he hit a rock or a log. Well, at first, Teddy tried 2 or 3 times to make it up over the abutment, and he couldn't make it. So my dad jumped, and he hit a log or a rock or something, and he got up on that river bank over the abutment. And then he took Teddy by the bridle, and he got up there and pulled that buggy up after him. And I can remember him coming in the house after he got home that night, and Mother saw that he was just sopping wet. And what a story that was, because we almost lost our father that night. Another thing that happened at this charge was Burton. He was kind of a firebug, and he loved to lay down in the grass, and he'd start a little fire in the grass and put his arm around it. So we had to watch him like a hawk. But my dad was holding revival meetings at one of these points, and they had a great big tent, and they had chairs in there. First they would put straw all over the ground, and then chairs on the straw, and they built a stage, and they had a piano on the stage, and they had gasoline lanterns for lighting. And one Sunday morning we missed, no, that isn't quite correct. One Sunday morning Burton came running into the tent where we lived, and he said, "Mama, I can't get the fire out." And boy, we rushed out of there and into the tent, and oh, was it going. It was going, and I just took off across the road yelling fire, and boy, the farmers began to come from all over, and Dad at that time was off to another point, one of the 3 points preaching. And the farmers came from all over, but the fire went up the sides of the tent, and but they got it out. And I can see them yet taking that piano off that platform and yanking it out the back of the tent. But that was another one of our very impressive experiences at that time. From there, we moved to North Star on the other side of Alma, and it was down in by St. Louis. And this was in the sugar beet area. And they would import every year a whole big group of Bohemians to work the sugar beets. And they had to be blocked and thinned and weeded. And I, of course, was in school, but during the summer, I'd get out there in those fields, but I had a particular reason for getting out in those fields. Those Bohemians in the middle of the morning would always have lunch. And they'd have drinks and sandwiches, and boy, I'd usually arrive about that time, and they'd take me in as their own. And because they were outsiders, the people around there used to call them bohunks. But they were great people. And things went along pretty good there. Another thing that happened, it was all clay soil, and they used to call that county, which is named Gratiot, Starving Gratiot, because the early settlers didn't know how to drain that land. And they couldn't raise crops because it would just be flooded out and the seed would rot right in the ground. Well, they finally discovered that by tiling the land and drain off that water, they had one of the richest properties that could be had. And the grain and the corn just grew, and they went into sugar beets, and oh, it was just a rich country.
Didn't they eventually discover oil under it too?
Yes, they did in this area. They
Top
discovered
it all
later.
off.
Yeah, but they had this great big tile factory, tile and brick factory there at North Star, and of course, if there's any activity around, that's where I was. And I went out there, and gee, I can remember I got a little job there, and I guess I was probably 10 years old, and I got up on this big mixer of clay, and my job was to run just enough water into that clay in the mixer so it make good, smooth tiles. Well, this is an awful dangerous job to put a kid on. I don't know how much money I made. But during that time, I had a friend that I played with, and his dad worked in this tile factory. And of course, they had to fire around the clock until the tile and brick were done in the kilns. And one Sunday, we were out there, and where they dug this clay out, it was filled up with water, just like a pond, but it was very deep, and the kids all swam in it. But this boy went in swimming, and boy, he went right under. And boy, did I set up a heck of a clatter. He could hear me for a mile, probably. But his dad couldn't swim either, but he came rushing out of the where they were firing brick, and he went right into that water, and I could see his hat today come up on top, and he went under that water, and he got that son of his and got him out of there before a whole lot of other people started coming from my yelling. And that was a very interesting experience that I had there. I can also remember at that time, we didn't have very much. It was during the First World War, and we didn't have too many clothes, and we didn't have too much to eat. And sugar was very scarce. And I can remember my mother boiling down sugar beets to get the sweetness from them for syrup for pancakes. And we still had Teddy, but we sold Teddy, and my father bought a Model T Ford. It was a 1917 Model T Ford. And boy, was that an automobile. It was just great.
Before you leave Teddy, you ought to say that he was the one who wore the jingle bells.
Oh, yes, that's right. He wore the sleigh bells, which I still have, and they are, I think they're bronze, but the tone on those bells are just perfect. They just ring wonderfully well. But we sold Teddy there to a farmer, and we followed Teddy, but he didn't live much longer. He got distemper, as I remember, and he was a driving horse. He wasn't a farm horse, but he was just part of our family, just like a dog would be a part of a family. And I can remember at that time that I wanted a pair of pointed shoes. They were very stylish. This is the first time anything like that hit me. And my dad, he always had to wear suspenders because a belt was too tight around the waist, and all us kids had to wear suspenders. And when it came to shoes, why, pointed shoes were a wrong thing because they cramped up your feet. Well, I had to do something about that. So first, I did have a wagon. I got a great big thing on top of a platform, and I can remember going over to the ice cream parlor, and ice cream always came in great big wooden things with the ice cream container in the middle, and it always come in on the train. And of course the ice was around it and all packed down so it wouldn't thaw. But I got a job hauling those containers back to the express office at 25 cents a piece. And I ruined my wagon, but I made quite a bit of money. And then I said, well, I didn't have my pointed shoes yet. So I said, I've got to do something about that. So I went over and I talked to Herb Eichenberg, who was the man who ran the grocery store. And I said, I got to make some money. How about a job? And he says, well, sure, Wesley. So I got a job there stocking the shelves and taking care of the stock room. And I can remember that all the farmers would bring in their eggs and their butter and their cream. And I finally ended up doing that too, grading eggs and what have you, and of course we'd sell the butter right there in the store. And that was probably the start of my mercantile experience right there, because I just enjoyed that immensely. And also they delivered groceries and they had a truck to do it. And boy, I had a chance to ride on that truck and run the groceries into the houses. And I learned an awful lot there. From there, we moved down to Climax. And at that time, I believe I was about 12 years old, just beginning adolescence. And Climax is a town where the first rural mail carrier started. That was the original town in Michigan where they started carrying mail. And they had a great big monument right on the square in commemoration of that. The one thing I remember about Climax is that it was right at the end of the war, and we moved down there about 1918 or 1919 during the big flu epidemic. And people were just dying right and left. And of course, my father being a minister, why, he would always go into the homes and see if he could be of any assistance and bring to them some consolation from a religious nature. But my father finally got the flu, and then my mother got it. They both got it at the same time, and my father almost died. But we kids, we three boys, I don't remember just how many of us had it, but I don't think I got it. But anyway, my grandfather Vestal, who was then living in Petoskey, he had retired and moved there from Iowa, came down, and he really ran the household. I can see him out in the kitchen with that wood stove cooking breakfast and luncheon and dinner for us. And he really took care of us until we got back on our feet. I think I missed something here.
There's one family story that I think you ought to include because it's pretty hilarious, and that's the huckleberry picking episode.
Oh yeah, that took place at North Star. I mentioned earlier this 1917 Ford touring car that we had bought. And my dad usually had a little nap in the afternoon, but this one, the huckleberries were ripe and they were abundant. And so the family, plus one other woman, and I don't remember who she was, we went huckleberrying. And we really got huckleberries. And it was the middle of the afternoon, and we were coming back. And of course, I had mentioned earlier that this land had to be drained, and there were big, deep ditches on both sides of the road to run off the water. And we were driving along real nice, and Dad mentioned it. He was sleeping. Well, I said, Dad, let me drive. No, he said, I'll make it. And Mother couldn't drive. She never could drive. But anyway, all of a sudden, we went into one of these ditches. And we tipped over on our side, and of course, there was mud and water in the bottom of the ditch. Well, the woman who was with us had a great big pan of huckleberries on her lap. And she went out the back of the curtain, pell-mell, back of the back seat. It was just a curtain, and she went out there and she didn't spill a huckleberry. But boy, there were huckleberries all over. And boy, it didn't take me long to get out of that car and up on the bank. And I can see my mother with just her chin over the side of the tipped-over car, saying,
her hat askew.
Yeah, her hat askew, saying, "Oh my God, oh my God."
Her glasses
hanging on one side. And then after that happened, boy, it got around town real fast, and everybody got out there to see their preacher in this predicament.
What's the matter with your preacher?
Yeah, he goes to sleep and runs in a ditch and tips over. They thought he had been tipping the bottle, I guess, or something. But that was quite an... We will go back and pick up one little... We will go back to Climax, because there's one event that happened there that should be recorded. And that's about Burton. He, at that time, got very sick, and the doctors there in this little town just didn't seem to be able to find out what was wrong. So Mother was a woman of action, and she bundled him up, and we drove to Galesburg, where there was an unusual doctor. And right away, he found out what was wrong, and it turned out to be jaundice. It's a liver ailment, and his face and body just turned a sickly yellow. But anyway, this doctor got him through it. But this was the beginning of his health problems in later years. Fact of the matter is, I think that probably that was the reason for his ultimate death, which we will pick up later on. From Climax, we moved to Ostimo, where my father had 3 points around the city of Kalamazoo. Ostimo was a little suburb. And Recreation Park was where they had the county races and the fair, and it was in the river bottom where it flooded every spring, and the other was at Comstock on the other side of town. But this was quite an eventful point for me particularly, because I was just coming into adolescence and becoming very interested in girls, and my first experiences along that line took place here. But they had only 10th grade school in this town of Ostimo, so my folks thought I'd better go someplace else for high school. So I took the exams and was accepted at State High School in Kalamazoo, and this was the training high school for Western Michigan University. So this particular 2 years was really a top grade experience for me, because it was right in the university, and big football games and baseball games were going on, and of course we had our own athletic program. And I can remember during that time that Muskegon was probably the top basketball team of the country, and they hadn't been beaten. Well, they came down to play us there in Kalamazoo, and we had a school of about 400 students. I wasn't playing then, but I can remember we beat Muskegon, and I can see Benny Oosterbaum tipping it in. They used to throw the ball toward the basket, and then the team would get around and tip it in. Well, after that game, they went on to the Nationals, and he became a very noted athlete at the University of Michigan after graduating from high school. But after those 2 years, my folks moved to Martin. And then I started to play basketball there. It was the first basketball team they ever had. It was a rural farming area, and I started in there and had 2 years of wonderful experiences. And I graduated at Martin, and we had 6 kids in our graduating class, so you can just about estimate the size of the school at that time. But I think this might be a good time for me to stop and let Mother have a crack at this, because after graduating, I went on to college, and I'll pick it up later. Mother?
Well, the interesting thing there was that Dad lived right beside a family named Pallet. And there was Sarah Pallet and her daughter, her maiden lady daughter,
Hattie.
And they got well acquainted with the Pallet family. There were others in the Pallet family also, farmers in the area.
Well, they were all related, and they
I guess
ultimately
that's
were
true.
related to you.
I guess that's
the Lukens.
Lukens. I don't know them down there, but after Dad and I got acquainted, we found out that he knew that branch of my family better than I did. Those were the people who from my father's side, and my father was William Harvey Richards. I hesitate because Aunt Georgia told me one time it was William Henry, but she was wrong. On their mother and dad's wedding uh, certificate, it's Harvey, so that was his name. Anyway, my life began on October 4th, 1911, in Bel Air, Michigan, born at the home that I grew up in. And I had two brothers ahead of me, William and George, or Bud. We called William Mim. Mim actually has three names: Bill, or Mim, or what's the other one?
WK's.
WK is another one. Anyway, those two older brothers were part of my growing up years. Uh, my brother William and I, he was just enough older so that we had many conflicts. He was a tease, and I didn't accept teasing too well, being the only girl, so there was quarreling there. Bud and I were very close in age, and Bud was a more calm personality and allowed me to be his little helper when he was remodeling boats. He was a great boat fixer, and he'd get an old hulk of a boat, and a friend gave him an old Buick engine, and we spent many hours out back of the garage fixing the boat, and I was the person who would hand him the screwdrivers. Said, "Oh, you shut that off over there, didn't you?"
That's right. So
How about that?
Look
That
at the
was
camera.
deliberate, huh? Okay. I would hand the screwdrivers and the wrenches and hold down things so that he could fix his boats, and it developed into a very close and loving brother-sister um, relationship. But my life was not interesting in the manner that Wes's was, because I lived there in that house with my mother and father and two brothers until I left for college. My mother's mother, Maximiliana Bechtold, lived just a short distance up the hill, and our early life was constantly associated with that family. Mother's mother and her brothers and sisters and many cousins who would visit in the summer to stay with Gross Mama for a week. Gross Mama was a matriarch of the first water, and so that relationship influenced my growing up years.
Well, she ran the family.
She certainly did.
Well,
That
Gross
was-
Papa had passed away at an early age, hadn't he?
Well, not too early. He died in 1915, and I'm not sure how old he was, but not really elderly. Gross Mama lived to be 96, and managed the family right up to the end almost.
You should tell about Gross Papa's businesses too, and how they came over here.
Yes, well, we have letters that you will have access to, you and the family, called the Gotthard letters. These were the letters written back to Germany in German from the first of the Bechtold family to come to this country. And none of us being able to read the old German script, Aunt Katie, mother's sister Katie, translated those quite a few years back. And those are the Gotthard letters that are very interesting. He tells of his coming across the ocean alone, and on shipboard he wrote these long and loving and lonely letters back to his family in Germany. He worked for a while in New York and then took the train to Pittsburgh, and from Pittsburgh, riverboat down to
Mississippi.
down the Ohio and all the rest of those connecting rivers to St. Louis. Then he persuaded the rest of the family, or at least his brother Fred and parents, to come to this country. that there was much more opportunity here. Europe was in the usual turmoil, and so the following year or two, my great-grandfather and his wife and my grandfather came to this country and landed in New York, where one of my grandfather's sisters was born. And from then on, this large family became Americans, settled in St. Louis, and I'm not sure what all they did. I think they worked for a while in a mattress place and anything they could get to do to get started. Out of that family of Grosspapa's brothers and sisters, there were a number of doctors. The university there in St. Louis, the medical school, was a good school, and that's where they went and settled in the little towns around Belleville, Illinois, for their medical years. Grosspapa, not being interested in medicine, came to Bel Air, Michigan, and started a woodenware factory. Of course, that territory at that time, in the late 1800s, was trees, covered with trees, hardwoods as well as pine, and so the woodenware factory, in which they made clothespins and bowls and butter molds and all kinds of wooden things for household use. That factory burned down about 3 times, and on the 3rd time, the hardwood was pretty well exhausted, and they turned then to banking. There was a bank in Bel Air, but the people wanted out, and so Grosspapa,
That was Tiffany, wasn't it?
I think so. I don't know whether he formed a company or had a partner or what, but they bought out the bank. And from then on, that was the family business. And it still is more or less a family affair.
Irma, I think before you go on that you should tell them how these letters came to you.
I did say that Aunt Katie translated the Gotthard letters.
But didn't they come to you from St. Louis?
Ah, yes, you're right. The originals of these Gotthard letters and many other of the old letters came to my mother from her Aunt Louise. Now, Aunt Louise was Grosspapa's sister, who had cared for the old parents until their death. And when she died, my mother was her namesake, and the little satchel of old papers were given to my mother. And it wasn't until after my mother was gone, my mother being Louise Bechtold Richards, that finally I discovered these old letters. And of course, by that time it was too late to ask Mother about them. And that's why Aunt Katie was the one to translate those letters. Mother and Will Richards, now we get back to the Richards family, were married, I can't tell you offhand in what year. Must have been about 1904 or 5, in there somewhere. They were married, and my father then worked for Frederick Bechtold, my mother's father, first in the woodenware business and then in the bank. And Dad finally was the cashier of the bank until his sudden death at age 57. I had a good time in growing up. It was a small town. The school was not far, but there was snow to be played in the wintertime. And when Wes was speaking of the butter molds that they used for firewood, we used the old seconds in the butter mold business, the great big bowls like this. As little kids, we'd get in those and slide down the hill, and that was great sport. Now they have little plastic discs they slide down the hill. But the buttermolds were fun until we got a little too big for them, and then of course we had to go to something else. The boys slid on a little saw that they rigged up with a turned up end and a little seat on it, and you'd steer that thing and balance it going down. Finally we turned to skis. Skis that only had one strap across the toe, no clamps to fasten on. Boy, your foot would just be out of those so fast. But we got along fine. We'd plow up the hill, and any way we could get there, and then shush down. No controlled skiing for us. We just went straight down the hills, and often fell. But we got so we could do pretty well with that.
Then you went into bobs, didn't you?
Oh, we had, at the same time, we had bobs, and Uncle Herbert had a big, long toboggan that we used to go out on. As a whole family, we'd go on the toboggan.
It'd take about 10 or 12 people, wouldn't it?
Depending on how many little kids you had there. But those winter sports were a great part of our fun. And then in the summer, of course, there was swimming and all the outdoor things that go with a country like that. Christmas was exciting at our house in that Santa always came. We never saw Santa, but he came and brought presents and decorated our tree for us. And so that was a typical German Christmas with all the cookies and goodies. And
I think you should go into a little detail on that Christmas. That is unusual.
well, we had this big old house with 2 stairways, a front and a back, and a large living room that could be closed off with double doors, big double doors that you could close. And about 3 days or more before Christmas, the big tree was put into the corner of the living room. These doors were closed. A sheet was hung up so we couldn't peek through the crack. And from then until Christmas Eve, we could not go into that living room. It was out of bounds for the children. My parents had to go in because their bedroom opened off from the living room. But they always notified Santa, I guess, if they were going to go through there. So when Christmas Eve came, our curiosity was absolutely boundless. And we would go to church first and then come home to oyster stew supper. And then we'd stand around in front of those double doors, and we could hear movement in the living room. And we could, through the crack of the curtain in the window, see that lights were beginning to come on the Christmas tree. And Santa would be in there, arranging the presents in piles for each person, and lighting the real candles that were on this big tree. And then he would come to the crack in the door and put a piece of paper through and run it up and down like this, jerking it along, and we children would grab it from the other side. And then we'd knock on the door, and we just played with Santa for a few minutes before he finally would rap real hard on the door. And then we knew that he was through with his work and had gone on to some other house. But our folks would give him time to get out of there before they'd open those curtains. And when they'd open the doors and take the sheet to one side, the smell of Christmas, the tree and the cookies and the burning candles and the apples and oranges that were in there, it was more, the memories are as strong of smell as they are of the sight of the Christmas. And of course, at that time, Grossmama and any uncles who were around were always included in our Christmas. So there'd be quite an extended family group there to enjoy the tree. And of course, the candles had to be blown out. We admired the tree, and then blew out the candles, and then starting with the youngest, which I was lucky enough to be, we'd begin opening our gifts. So it was a pretty exciting Christmas season. I played basketball. Oh, I should say I studied piano. I took piano lessons from a rather early age, I guess, and violin, and played in the high school orchestra, and played in a theater. We had a little theater where they showed silent films, and my violin teacher would play either piano or violin. I sometimes played piano and sometimes played violin for the music that went with the silent pictures, and the movie companies would send along a folder with score for what was going to be happening. So you knew if you should be on an exciting piece of music for the horses galloping along, or whether you should be on a tender love sort of music for the quieter love scenes. And that was quite a good experience to do that with Ruth Soul, the music director there. We had a little orchestra in school, which I played in, played violin, and I taught a little group of young children in an orchestra during high school. I also played basketball. In those days we had girls' basketball rules, had 3 courts. In the 2 end courts were the guards and forwards. In the middle court was the jumping center and the running center. And I was the running center. I was too short to be good at forward or guard or jumping center, but running center, I was pretty fast and I could get myself around here and there. When I finally went to college after graduation, I also played basketball there. And I'm proud to say that I made the all-star team. However, we played just 2-court basketball in college, which was a little different. But it was during my high school, my senior year in high school, that I met your Wes. His parents had moved to Bel Air as the minister in Bel Air the fall of 1928.
Okay.
Say when.
When?
After the Baker family moved to Bel Air as the minister's family, I was a senior in high school, and at Christmas time, my mother had been intending to invite the Baker family up to our home for a meal, and just had never gotten around to it until at the time of the Christmas vacation. And she had called Mrs. Baker and asked if she'd come to dinner. And she said, oh, she was sorry that particular time, but their son was coming home from college. And so she didn't know, and my mother said, naturally, well, just would you like to come and bring him along then, too? Burton and Herrick were there, and so on. So she accepted the invitation, and they came to dinner, Wesley and Burton, who was in my class in high school, and Herrick, who was 4 years, I guess, no, 2 years younger than Burton. And but my brothers had both found other places where they had to go because they didn't want any part of this minister's family business. That indicates what their thinking was at the time. So my brothers weren't there, but
And I haven't let them forget it either.
no, that's true. You haven't. So anyway, they came to dinner. We had a nice time, and after dinner, when the folks were visiting in the living room, the 3 Baker boys and I played caroms out in our dining room, and that was my introduction to Wesley. Now you can take it from there. I'll chip in if I want
Okay,
something
but
else to say.
we'll have to go back to Martin. That's where I left off. And my folks had very little money. They couldn't afford to send me to college. And so what do? They felt that all of us boys should be educated. So mother, being the kind of a gal she is, began to feel around what we could do to get money, and finally I put in, and Dad and my brothers helped too, put in 6 acres, no, 3 acres of cucumbers. Well, boy, did we grow cucumbers, and we had to take them up to another small town every night and take them in there and stand in line, and we'd get our money that night. But I can remember that summer we made $300. Then the summer I was going to go to college, well, you had to get into the bigger money, so $300 would only go for about a half a year of college at that time. So we had a family by the name of Martin Boyson, who had 1,000 acres of muck land in the Gun Lake Marsh, not too far from Martin. And he said to my folks, well, why don't you have Wesley come up and raise a few onions? So that's what I did. I took on 3 acres, and Burton helped me, and Mother helped too. She'd go out and get down on her knees, and we raised those onions. He put them in, Martin Boyson put them in and fertilized them, then we cared for them and harvested them. And then Mr. Boyson would sell them. But that particular year, I think we made about $700 or $800 on that 3 acres of onions. So that put me through that first year of college, and that was quite a year. I really wanted to go to Kalamazoo College because I'd gone to State High and I knew Kalamazoo, but no, I was a Methodist. I had to go to Albion, and so that's where Dad dumped me. And I can remember that first day of college, why he had to find me a place to live outside because there were no dormitories for men at that time. So I lived with a doctor, and I had certain chores around there for my room, like keeping up the lawn and shoveling the snow, etc. It was quite a ways from college, so I had a pretty good walk every day. But I wasn't happy there because I was all alone, and I was always a person who needed kids around me, and it wasn't long I got out of there and got into a rooming house right on campus. And incidentally, this rooming house was run by the parents of the Dean of Women. I think her name was Wilder. But it was a great place to live. And of course I went out for basketball, and I'd always said that when I got to college I just couldn't afford to join a fraternity. I didn't have a lot of money, but I had enough. And I was also, being a minister's son, I was on a scholarship. I think I got $50 on that minister's son's scholarship. But I went out for basketball. Well, as soon as I went out for basketball, then the fraternities were really after me. And long in the spring, I decided to join the Tau Kappa Epsilon. And it was one of the nicest things that happened to me in college, because coming from a small town and the social availability with different people, although I met people through the church, not that kind, not in the college atmosphere. And joining this fraternity was a wonderful experience. And it was a fraternity that always had good scholarship, and although it was plenty alive from an activity standpoint, marks came first. And I must say right here that my marks were never too good. What?
Do you have to add that?
Well, I got by. Let's put it that way. Because I had moved from school to school, and I lacked a lot of background in what I should have had for college. Well, I completed that first year. I should go back. The first year, when the folks moved to Blair, I thought, my gosh, why did the conference send Dad up to that godforsaken hole in northern Michigan? And Thanksgiving came along, and a fraternity brother of mine by the name of Holcomb, whose father was a doctor in Grand Rapids, said, well, why don't you come on and go home with me? We'll have a few dates and have a good time.
Yeah,
So,
hang on.
Yeah, gotta get the mask
Gotta get a little-
banded
gotta
in
get the
here.
mask banded in here.
yeah, got to put some life in this story.
Yeah, I'm
Who is
sorry.
that?
Kitty, kitty.
These kids have been very patient.
They have
Yeah.
been good as
So-
gold.
So I didn't go to Blair for Thanksgiving.